My name is Ed Moser, and I want to welcome you all to the my Lafayette Square tours of scandal, assassination, and intrigue. And this is the special Potomac Tea Party edition with the life and times of George Washington in his hometown of Alexandria, Virginia. I think you'll be pleasantly surprised at how many houses, locales are associated with the life of the first commander-in-chief, the first president, including this house here. And this property is an amazing private-public partnership. This is the Patrick Murray home. Mr. Murray was a friend of George Washington. He was a livery maker. He made clothes. He may have made General Washington's uniforms. Acquired this beautiful ranch house, which dates from before the founding of Alexandria, Virginia, which was in 1749. By the way, it's been beautifully restored. They try to keep it as much of the 1700s as possible with the original metals and bricks and the restored wood. And actually, they even have the old the privy that George himself used behind these walls here. It's basically just a hole in the ground with some brick around it. Bad times came upon Mr. Murray, and he had to sell his property to a man named Mr. Dick, D-I-C-K, like a private eye, a Dick, who happened to be George Washington's private physician, Dr. Dick. We'll come upon him again later in the tour. He's one of the prominent physicians in Old Town at the time. Some background, George Washington's brother actually co-founded Alexandria, Virginia. That was Lawrence Washington. Lawrence Washington was his beloved older brother, who died early on, caught disease and died early on. But not before, in 1749, he made a trip to this place, to Williamsburg, the capital of Colonial Virginia, and he got permission from the House of Burgesses, the Colonial Assembly, to build a brand new merchant city here on the Potomac River, Alexandria, named after John Alexander, who had much of the property around here. And it was a rival city to a place upriver called Georgetown. Yeah. Actually, the Marylanders got very jealous of this spectacularly lucrative and successful merchant city, seaport town of Alexandria, and they founded Georgetown as a competitor to Alexandria. Buckling on the verge of collapsing. And so what they do is they stick iron rods through the length of the building and attach them with these stars so that they don't collapse on. That's an old fire engine, horse-drawn. And of course, back in the day, before they had public fire departments, you had to buy your own fire insurance for your own building. And if you didn't pay your fire insurance and a fire broke out, the firemen would come here and they'd check to see if you had one of these insignias. If you didn't, they would let your house burn down. You had to pay your fire insurance. You absolutely had to. Eventually, of course, it became a municipal function, and everybody got fire insurance, so to speak. But some of these insignias still remain. Notice as you walk around these colonial era and early federal period buildings, you'll see these sculptures of pineapples. This has to do with the trade with China all the way back to the 1700s, with New England and Mid-Atlantic and Chesapeake merchants sailing all the way to China and the Philippines, where they would gather pineapples, put them in the holds of their ship, in the cool holds of their ships, bring them all the way back to America. And it was the greatest sign of generosity if you acquired pineapples and other fruit from Asia and were able to present them to your guests coming to your house. And so this for centuries been a token of hospitality here in Old Town, from the old merchant ships of the old merchant city. But with the Civil War, just to give you some quick Civil War history. This house was actually the home of the Union general who occupied Alexandria, a largely pro-Confederate city during the Civil War. he took this house for a very good reason, because the house was previously owned by a man named Janney, who ran the secessionist conference in Richmond, Virginia, by which Virginia broke away from the Union and joined the Confederacy. Mr. Janney was actually of Quaker background, very skeptical about slavery. There you go, even more pineapples here, right on the threshold. Very good vision there. Mr. Janney was of Quaker background, skeptical of slavery, and he hated the idea of breaking away from the Union. And actually, I was surprised to learn there were 2 secession conferences in 1861. And in the first conference, Virginia voted to stay with the Union. I wasn't aware of that. But then Fort Sumter happened, and Lincoln's call up of the volunteers, and passions went crazy, and on the second vote, Virginia broke away. Despite Mr. Janney opposing it, when the Union troops came here, the Union Commandant took over this building. So it's associated with Quakerism, abolition, Confederacy, and the Union. Great amount of Civil War history right here in this one place. At the time of the Revolution, people weren't very happy with people who remained loyal to King George, and sometimes they did bad things to them. Like they would take the loyalists and put tar on them, oil and tar, and then put feathers on them, which were very, very hard to take off, sort of branding them as traitors to the American Revolution. Benjamin Dunleavy was one such man. However, he avoided tar and feathering for an unusual reason, which I'll explain. What business do you think Mr. Dunleavy ran out of his place? What is this? This is a barn, but what's this? It's a stable. What do you keep in a stable? You keep horses here. And the reason that Mr. Dunleavy was not tarred and feathered is that from this spot he sold horses to this fellow. He sold George Washington's famous war horses in the American Revolution. And that's one of them right there. General Washington and Mr. Dunleavy were actually very good friends. But Dunleavy is an Irish name, and he loved having parties here where the whiskey was flowing. You know that when Dunleavy had a party here, he would ask all his guests to dance. Now, he didn't actually ask them. He would order all his guests to dance. The minuet or other dances at the time. And if you refused to dance, Mr. Dunleavy would take out a revolver and pointing at the floor and start shooting until you started dancing very, very fast. One time, his wife, as you might expect, took offense at Mr. Dunleavy, and she complained about him shooting up the house. And what he did was he grabbed his wife and he stuck her in the clothes closet and locked it for the balance of the party. He was a piece of work, Mr. Dunleavy. Yes, indeed. But he did survive tarring and feathering by selling horses to George Washington. So he was a candy as well as a crazy man. Which was in 1824, when the man second most responsible for attaining America's independence came to visit Alexandria. In 1820, who was that? Who was America's key ally in the Revolution?
France.
Without the French, we'd be speaking in British accents today and eating bangers for breakfast. Thank God for Lafayette. And when Lafayette visited Alexandria in 1824 as an old man on his reunion tour, he was given the place of honor across the street, one of the Fairfax mansions of Lord Fairfax, the biggest owner of property in what became Fairfax County. He stayed across the street. And the citizens of Alexandria asked him to speak to thousands of people who gathered here to see this legend from the Revolution. But the city fathers had forgot to construct a platform, a speaking platform. So the Marquis said, sacre bleu, I'll just come across the street, up these stairs, and address the crowd right from here. The second most important man in the American Revolution. And he made, during his tour in this area, he made a prediction. The prediction of Lafayette about the future role of America, which some people believe was very prophetic about the 2 world wars. Lafayette said that, I was very happy, mon American, I was very happy to help you win your independence and liberty during your revolution. But I think in the future, as you grow into a grand and powerful nation, you will be the salvation of the world. Perhaps you'll save my own country at some future time, which America, of course, did in the First and Second World Wars, liberating France from the boot of the Nazis and others. And Lafayette spoke right from this spot. Just a few blocks down, across from the funeral home, and during Washington's day, can anyone guess, it wasn't a condominium, can anyone guess what its purpose was? What this was a clubhouse for one of Washington's favorite pursuits, which was horse riding. He was a famous equestrian. According to Thomas Jefferson, George Washington was the finest equestrian in all of Virginia, which was quite a statement because Virginia then as now was horse country, with many, many good jockeys and riders, and Washington supposedly was the best. And this was his clubhouse where he repaired after watching horse races on Green Street, next to the townhouse. If you go to the Green Funeral Home, which dates from Washington's time, the Green Funeral Home was a smaller clubhouse behind a quarter-mile racetrack. You can still see the traces of it today. It's the big depression below the funeral home. And it was a site of a quarter-mile racetrack where Washington and his friends would watch the races and then repair and puff smoke and have a good old time. Now, I should add that the horse races back then were totally different from today. Back then, horse racing was a blood sport. We would take the strongest guy around, he might be 200 pounds, and he would ride the horses, and it would be like Ben-Hur in the arena. They're two of the most contrasting churches you can imagine. On the left you have a Catholic basilica. On the right you have a Scottish Presbyterian church. To me, you couldn't have a more dramatic visual representation of Southern Europe on the left, representing Italy and Spain, Catholicism, and then on the right, the much more Spartan and spare Protestantism of Northern Europe, such as the Scottish Presbyterians. Yet, although in Europe there were terrible religious wars between these two different religions, here from Washington's time, they're living side by side in peace. Largely because of George Washington. Because the Catholic Basilica on the left was built by George Washington's aide-de-camp in the American Revolution, Colonel John Fitzgerald, a good Irish Catholic. Jefferson made a famous letter to the Baptists of New England who were facing oppression from the Puritans, the Presbyterians of New England, saying that, it has the phrase, the separation of church and state, where he doesn't mean like to forbid religion. He says there shall be no official religion in America, such as the Church of England in England, or the Catholic Church in Spain. Mr. Jefferson and Mr. Madison walked up King Street all the way to where the George Washington Masonic Temple is today. It was called Shooter's Hill, was it?
Yes.
And Madison and Jefferson had scouted out the Masonic Temple Hill for the possibility of placing the Capitol building upon it. That was the original location of what was to become the Capitol building until they decided to take over the hill in Washington, D.C. proper. And of course, you're familiar with the tomb of the unknown soldier in Arlington National Cemetery. Well, the original tomb of the unknown soldier is here in Alexandria, Virginia. After the First World War, they decided to find an unknown American of the Revolutionary War. And he wasn't a Presbyterian, he was actually a Catholic from the St. Mary's Church on the other side of the wall, where he lay buried, and is still in his Revolutionary War uniform. They unearthed his body, they brought it here to the Presbyterian Church, and with great ceremony, with, I believe it was President Harding at the time in the 1920s, they laid him to rest right at this spot. This is the tomb of the unknown soldier of the American Revolution. Yes. very honored place. And the transcription on his grave, I think, speaks to Americans today. And I think it's brief enough to read. It says, here lies a soldier of the Revolution whose identity is known but to God. His was an idealism that recognized as a supreme being, that planted religious liberty on our shores, that overthrew despotism, that established a people's government, that wrote a constitution setting metes and bounds of delegated authority, that fixed a standard of value upon men above gold, and lifted high the torch of civil liberty among and along the pathway of all mankind. Some beautiful words.
Yes.
In ourselves, this soul that exists as part of ours now lies in memory's mansion. Isn't that beautiful? Wonderful tune. Wonderful tune. Adams was so fearful of war breaking out, of a general war breaking out with mighty France, he decided to call in the best soldier he could think of out of retirement to lead the American army in the event of a possible war. Who did he call? Who do you call when you're in trouble? In 1798. George Washington came out of retirement. He was barely out of retirement after 60 years of public service, finally getting to enjoy his estate down the river in Mount Vernon. Of course, he has to answer the call from Mr. Adams. He puts on his uniform from the Revolution and goes off to lead the American army again. John Adams, though, along with a believer that you have to prepare for war if it comes, he was also a man of peace. And he sent a noted emissary to Paris to negotiate with the French, a man named John Marshall, the famous Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, then the Secretary of State for Mr. Adams. And John Marshall managed to negotiate a peace treaty with Paris as Adams and Washington in this church declared a national day of prayer and fasting for peace with our former ally of France. It must have worked because Mr. Marshall came back to Paris with his peace treaty. And war was averted with our ally from the Revolution, and we've never had a war with France. Washington gets to take his uniform off, go back to Mount Vernon. He dies the next year. He never really enjoys his retirement at all. He's always in public service. Washington in 1799, he finally goes back to Mount Vernon in true retirement. War with France has been averted. He spends his time in his fields, his farms. He likes to ride his horse around his properties. One day there's a very bad rainstorm. He catches his death of cold. He comes back to Mount Vernon. He's got a chill, a cough. But King George Washington, he's a man of discipline and labor. He sits down and he works for a number of hours in his wet clothes before even taking them off. That night he gets deathly ill. What happened was his epiglottis, a tongue of skin in his throat, swelled up, blocking his throat passage. He could barely breathe, and he couldn't take down anything. Therapy that the French and the British are trying. It's called a tracheotomy, where you drill a hole into the throat of the afflicted person, and you at least allow them to breathe, and maybe even put some soup, some liquids down into their stomach. But Dr. Craig and Dr. Dick overruled the younger doctor, and they proposed a third remedy. Bleeding. Yeah. Bleeding. Not leeches. Leeches was mild bleeding. They went the real thing. Washington was a huge man, 6'4", 250 pounds. He'd be a tight end, NFL tight end today. But he had some of the newfangled ideas of medicine of the time. And he went up to Martha Washington, and he said, "Martha, I have an idea for reviving your husband from the grave. If we take blood from sheep and inject it into his veins, and then we warm his body, perhaps with electrified cables, we can bring him back to life." Fortunately, Martha Washington put her foot down big time. And she said, "My husband has suffered enough. You're not going to touch him, Dr. Bell." And he was allowed to rest in peace. And he became a protector, a protege of a very skillful young lawyer who became famous for his powers of oratory, especially at the start of the Revolution, when at a church in Richmond, Virginia, he addressed an assembly like this. And he said, "I know not what others may think, but as for myself, give me liberty or give me death." That was the Revolutionary War governor of Virginia, Patrick Henry. His protege, Mr. Thompson, lives in that building right here, right in the town of George Washington. Patrick Henry served as the first governor of independent Virginia, independent for Britain. And then Mr. Jefferson became governor. And a man named Benjamin Harrison V was also governor. And it's good to see in modern times that the current governors of Virginia have the same stature among us as Mr. Jefferson and Mr. Henry. That's a joke. Home in 1774 for a fellow planter of George Washington, a fellow George named George Mason, where he wrote the Virginia Resolves, a series of grievances against the British king, against the colonies. His Resolves of 1774 formed the basis, almost word for word, for his other friend Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence in July of 1776. Very much composed by George Mason here in 1774. 15 years later, when George Washington, Hamilton, and James Madison started to form the new, stronger central government, the new federal government under the federal constitution, some objected, like Patrick Henry, which protege of the man whose house was passed, Patrick Henry, Sam Adams of Massachusetts, and George Mason. Many prominent men objected to the new constitution, fearful that it would lead to a new tyranny of a central government along the lines of King George of Old England. How to prevent tyranny? Turn to the wisest man in all the colonies, as Thomas Jefferson called him, to George Mason. And here in this spot, among others, he crafted the first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution, our Bill of Rights, including freedom of speech, freedom of religion, etc. Crafted by George Mason at his Mason estate and here at the City Hall Assembly Place. This became a building block of American Republican democracy. That originally is the William Ramsay House. Ramsay is a Scottish name, and Ramsay is one of those Scottish merchant founders of Old Town Alexandria. But that's not the original locale of his movable house. William Ramsay originally lived over by where the Wilson Bridge is today. He got envious of Lawrence Washington and John Carlisle and the others having houses here in this fabulously lucrative merchant city. And he determined to move his house to the spot where the Potomac River shoreline was at the time. And so he had a barge and a crane go to his house down by Cameron Run, 4 miles south of the Potomac, and the crane lifted this house up into the air onto a barge. And then they floated it down the Potomac spot where the crane then plopped it right here, right next to City Hall, where the power and the wealth lay. And it's remained here ever since. The famous moving house of the Scottish merchant, a friend of George Washington. It was known as the Commons back in Washington's time, and this is where he drilled his soldiers under British auspices during the French and Indian War, and then at the dawn of the American Revolution. General Washington would drill his soldiers, his colonial militia right here. This town was founded in 1749. By the Revolution, by the 1770s, they filled this in. Who put these cobblestone streets down during the late 1700s? What group of people laid down these cobblestones? It has to do with the American Revolution. British? Close. I think he was the first. The British were the British people, God bless them. They didn't really want to fight against their American brethren in the Revolution. So what was King George to do? He hired mercenaries from that country famed for its military prowess, the German-speaking countries, from the province of Hesse, and he brought in Hessians to fight us at Delaware, at the battles of Princeton and Trenton and whatnot. And it was Hessian prisoners of war who were brought to Alexandria, Virginia, and during the Revolution, they were put to work laying down these cobblestone streets.